Okay, today we start the unit on web security. I hope you're excited. So as we did with the memory safety unit and the cryptography unit, the very first lecture, which is this one, is going to just be an introduction on what the web is, what parts of the web you have to be familiar with. So before we do any attacks and before we start breaking things, we'll first give you a really quick speed run on how things work. And then starting next time, we will think about attacks and how to break things. So that's the outline for today. So the first thing we'll do is give you a 2-minute, very brief history of how the web came to be. So something you'll notice as we go through this history is that the web was not designed in with security from the start. And if you remember one of our security principles, we said when you're building a new system, you should start by thinking about security. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck with a lot of ugly patches later to add security into your system. So when we look at web security, if you're wondering why there's all these ugly patches and why things seem to be really strange, why did they design it in this way? It's because we didn't design with security in mind. And as a result, a lot of modern web security vulnerabilities exist, and they have to be patched in somewhat awkward ways. So in some ways, this is like a lesson of what not to do. But we'll go through the history anyway. So you don't have to memorize this. It's OK. But if you go all the way back to the 1940s, there were these ideas of trying to organize these very small cards. So I don't know if people are old enough to remember this. But back in the day when libraries had to store information, what they would do is they would write the information in extremely small font, like size 0.1 font. And then they would give you a magnifying glass to view the documents. And they needed some way to organize all those little cards of text. So you don't have to know what that is, but the interesting ideas from the inventions back then were trails and uploading data. And these might look familiar if you use the web today. So one thing they decided was that every card or every piece of information gets a unique identifier. And if I tell you that identifier, you can track down that card. That's kind of similar to what we do today on the web. And also, anyone could upload their own data and write it in that small 0.1 font and put it in this desk, and anyone else can access it as well. So this thing that we're talking about called Memex, it wasn't actually built. It was a theoretical idea. But some of these ideas came back later when it was time to design the web. So now we fast forward. OK, so now we fast forward to the 1990s when they started to actually design the World Wide Web. And this era, sometimes people call it Web 1.0. And in Web 1.0, most of the data that people were sending on the web was static content. So these are things like text files, images, PDFs. These weren't things that were interactive. You couldn't click a button and have something interesting happen. They were just pieces of documents that you could read and access, and that's basically it. So for a lot of the 1990s, if you wanted to access things on the internet or on the web, you would just download a file, you would read the file, and that's basically the end of your web browsing. And eventually, people started to think, well, what if instead of sending texts and images, what if I could send like code? What if I could make the code do interesting things? And so around the 1990s, people tried to put Java in web browsers. Ultimately, Java was too powerful for web browsers. So we started to move towards something called JavaScript. And this might be a good time, if you've never heard this before, to remind you that Java and JavaScript have nothing in common besides the name. I don't know why they named it that, but it is what they named them. But ultimately, eventually, they were able to integrate code into the web so that in addition to sending files, you could also send code. And the code could run in your web browser and do interesting things. And nowadays, a lot of applications do this. They run code in your browser and allow you to run interesting applications in your browser. And that's something we'll see when we talk about Web 2. So none of this is stuff you have to memorize, but kind of the takeaway is that you'll see that JavaScript is a language that we use in the web. It's not the best of languages. There are some issues with the security of it and things like that. But there are also variants like TypeScript that you also could look into. So We're not a class that's like ranking programming languages, except C, which is at the bottom, but JavaScript is another language you can consider using. OK, so web aside, here's some joke that someone made about JavaScript. That's kind of a brief history of the web. And now we can start going into all of the definitions.